Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And I know there's a lot of people on the web who are listening in. I am Prith Banerjee, Senior Vice President of Research and Director of HP Labs. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our World Voices series, a talk on working toward a world free of nuclear weapons. The World Voices series is a joint partnership between ESSN, Learning and Development Program in the R&D Engineering Research Seminar Series, and HP Labs. Today we are honored to have with us 4 leading statesmen and scholars, all of whom are known to all of you, I'm sure. George Schultz, who was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan between 1982 and 1989. He is currently a distinguished fellow at the Hoover Institute. William Perry, who was the U.S. Secretary of Defense under President Clinton from 1994 to 97. He is currently a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute. Sam Nunn, who was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee from 87 to 95 and a U.S. Senator for 24 years. He is currently the CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative and informal advisor to President Obama. Schultz, Perry, and Nunn had written an op-ed with Henry Kissinger in January of 2007 in the Wall Street Journal, outlining a roadmap to eliminate all nuclear weapons. We also have Philip Taubman with us as the moderator of today's talk. He was a reporter and editor of the New York Times for almost 30 years, and right now is a professor and associate vice president of University Affairs at Stanford. Philip just finished a book called The Partnership. We have actually copies of this here, about a collaboration of these men, and he will lead a panel discussion, after which we'll open the floor to questions and discussions. Thank you all for coming, and I would like to welcome our visitors today. Philip?
Thank you very much for coming this morning. I was saying as I came in the front door that I actually worked at Hewlett-Packard one summer for several months at the invitation of John Young when I was a student at Stanford, and this program at the time was called Radical in Residence. The idea was to bring an obstreperous Stanford student over here to spend a summer learning about the corporate world. I don't think I would be accurately described as a radical at the time, but I certainly had a very interesting summer. It was the era when Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett were working right upstairs in those offices. It was a real thrill for me to be here. So, and it is again, thank you, as I say. Let me begin the discussion by suggesting that I think most people believe that nuclear threats either disappeared at the end of the Cold War or certainly receded to a degree where they're not an issue in the forefront today. I think if any of you have watched the Republican debates, you've not heard much in those discussions about nuclear weapons or nuclear threats. But I think the reality is in fact very different. And we have 3 terrific people here this morning to talk about the state of nuclear weapons and the nuclear threats today and what we can do about it. So let me start, if I may, with Senator Nunn. How would you describe today to people the state of nuclear threats? Are we in the clear, or do we have a lot to worry about?
Well, there's several dimensions of this, and I'll try to do it in a very brief fashion. But basically, we have a lot less chance of an all-out war than we did, of course, during the Cold War. Our relationship with Russia has fundamentally changed. We still have, of course, a lot of disagreements with Russia, but they are the heaviest armed nuclear power other than the United States in the world. The other nuclear powers, China, Britain, and France, historic nuclear powers, do not have nearly as many weapons as U.S. and Russia. And we've just completed a new treaty with Russia to reduce the number of deployed weapons to 1,500. That treaty will be implemented over a period of time. We have been working with the Russians now since the end of the Cold War to try to help them get control of their nuclear materials. 3 nuclear countries during the Soviet days, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, have given up all their nuclear weapons. Bill played a huge role in that when he was Secretary of Defense. So in one sense, there's a whole lot less chance of a worldwide nuclear war. In another sense, we have more dangers because we have a perfect storm in terms of terrorist groups trying to get nuclear weapons, in terms of the knowledge of how to build a crude nuclear weapon, not one that would fly through space on an ICBM, but a crude weapon. That knowledge is out there now. It was not for many years, and it is. We, for a long time, thought only a state could build a nuclear weapon. No longer true. And we have highly enriched uranium and plutonium spread all over the world. My foundation just did an index where we rated 32 countries around the globe that have weapons usable material. So the combination of terrorist groups trying to get the weapons, the proliferation of knowledge, and the location of weapon-grade nuclear material in a lot of different spots around the world indicate, at least to me, subjective judgment, that there's more danger of a nuclear use than there was during the Cold War, less danger of an all-out nuclear war. The biggest danger of a large exchange, in my view, would be between India and Pakistan. That is a real serious problem. We can talk about more. The other would be an accidental launch, which is not likely, but could be so catastrophic that we must do everything we can to prevent it. That accidental launch could come from any of the nuclear powers, and it could precipitate a larger exchange, but just one weapon going off would change the world. So that's the way I diagnose it, Philip. It's a mixed bag. Overall, a lot less chance of an all-out nuclear war between the United States and Russia. That would, in my view, have to happen by mistake. I don't think anybody would intend that now, but more chance of a nuclear explosion which could shake the confidence of the world by a terrorist group. The final part of the perfect storm is a terrorist group does not have a return address, and many of them are suicidal. So deterrence, as we knew it during the Cold War, with nuclear weapons is a dimension that would be missing with terrorists. And George and I and Bill have had a lot of discussions about how we begin to deter military action or attempts to destabilize the world without having to rely on nuclear weapons. We have come to think of deterrence as synonymous with nuclear weapons, but deterrence has existed since the beginning of mankind, and we've got to find a way in today's world to deter military conflict without threatening to blow up the world.
Secretary Schultz, when you were at Reykjavik in 1986 with Ronald Reagan, and you had these discussions with Mikhail Gorbachev and the Soviet Foreign Minister Eduardo Shevardnadze, you actually talked briefly in those negotiations about eliminating nuclear weapons altogether. It was considered a radical proposal at the time, and a lot of that meeting was devoted to a very extensive discussion about a step short of eliminating nuclear weapons, but still a very important step, which would be the elimination of ballistic missiles. So then, fast forward to 2006. All of you are retired from government service, including Henry Kissinger. You meet at Stanford to talk about what happened at Reykjavik and to try to take the spirit of that and project it forward. Why don't you talk a little bit about your thinking, how your thinking has evolved and how this issue has evolved over the last 10 years or so?
Just to go back to Reykjavik, it was a surprise to people that we talked about getting rid of nuclear weapons, but in many ways it shouldn't have been, because Ronald Reagan had talked publicly about his desire to get rid of nuclear weapons on a number of occasions before that. It's interesting to notice that early in his presidency, he asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff to tell him what would happen in the United States if there were an all-out Soviet nuclear attack on us. And they came back sometime later, and this is in the notes of the National Security Council meetings that have recently been declassified, that the initial casualties would be on the order of 150 million people, and subsequent casualties on because we would have no infrastructure left. So then he was asked, would he retaliate? And they said, well, on the assumption that the Soviets would have known they were going to be retaliated against, they would have done a lot of things. Probably the casualties would not be so high, but they would be in the tens of millions. And he said, and kept saying, what's so good about keeping the peace by an ability to wipe each other out? You remember before Reykjavik, there was a meeting between Reagan and Gorbachev in Geneva, the first one they had. And the joint statement after that meeting, they said a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. That is, what's the point of a war that wipes each other out? You haven't won anything. So there was a lot of precedent. And at the same time, it was a surprise. And I remember coming back from Reykjavik, I was virtually summoned to the British ambassador's residence. And Margaret Thatcher was there. You remember she used to carry a little stiff handbag all the time? I learned there's a verb in the British language called to be handbagged. And I got handbagged. George, how could you sit there and allow the president to talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons? Margaret, he's the president. Yes, but you're supposed to be the one with his feet up. But Margaret, I agreed with him. It was wild. But since the end of the Cold War, we thought the issue has kind of gone to sleep. People have not been paying any attention. So when we started to have a conference at Hoover, Sid Drell and I and Bill joined us, we were going to explore the implications of what happened. And I think, Sam, you came the summer before. You couldn't come to the meeting, but you came and we spent a long afternoon together and talked about this and even put down some thoughts. And I remember showing those thoughts to Henry Kissinger later that summer. So we began to form a point of view. And the op-ed that we wrote in 2007 sort of jolted the world because it brought the subject back up on the front burner. And people could begin to see what Sam was talking about, that this is a subject that needed attention. And since that time, it's amazing what's happened. It's been all over the world. The UN Security Council has convened and had a unanimous vote to create the conditions for a world free of nuclear weapons. President Obama convened a meeting of some 40 heads of government to deal with fissile material. There's a follow-on meeting in Korea about to take place. So a great deal has taken place since that time, but still we face big challenges. In that UN Security Council meeting, it was interesting. Toward the end, President Sarkozy of France spoke. Of course, the French always have a little different angle on things. But he said, yes, we're all in favor of this, but let's get real. If we can't stop a country like North Korea from getting a nuclear weapon, if we can't stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, where are we? So we'll put the issue in stark terms that these two developments are threatening.
So, Secretary Perry, as someone who managed American military forces, when you look at clearly the most dangerous proliferation threats we face today are North Korea, Pakistan, particularly if Pakistan implodes and disintegrates, and the possibility of Iran developing nuclear weapons. What ought we to do about those three programs?
It's been the policy of our government for many years that they should not have nuclear weapons. That policy has been unsuccessfully implemented. North Korea has defied us and gone ahead with nuclear weapons. And they have traded in nuclear technology. They sold a nuclear reactor to Syria. And we don't know in detail what they're doing, but we do know that they're dealing with Iran and share nuclear technology. That's very dangerous. Iran, it could be equally dangerous, although I do believe the most dangerous country in the world today from a nuclear point of view is Pakistan, because they have 100 nuclear weapons. They're building more. They have tons of fissile material, and they're building more. And their government is friendly to the United States, but it's unstable. They've got a violent insurgency going on in the northern part of the country. So that is dangerous because of the instability in the country today and because of the presence of so many nuclear weapons. In terms of Iran, which is going to be the issue of the moment, the United States is banding with other countries, European countries in particular, to impose substantial sanctions on Iran and trying to persuade them, coerce them is a better word, into giving up their nuclear weapon program. So far unsuccessful. I do believe, though, that the sanctions, the financial sanctions, the sanctions that cut down their dealings in international banks are really starting to hurt now. And I think that is in the right direction. What I think we can do to increase the effectiveness of those sanctions is to work through our diplomacy to try to persuade Russia and China that a nuclear Iran would be dangerous to them as well as to the rest of the world, and to join those sanctions, because I think if the whole world joined together in those sanctions, they had a much better chance of being effective. Iran is particularly dangerous and particularly complicated because if they proceed with the nuclear weapon program, it is entirely possible, even probable, I would say, that Israel would consider their existence so threatened by an Iranian nuclear weapon that they might conduct a military strike against the Iranian nuclear program, as they did earlier against Syria and as they did earlier against Iraq. The taking out the Iranian nuclear program is much more complex, much more difficult than either Iraq or Syria, but Israel may very well attempt to do it anyway, and they might even be at least successful, at least to some degree. But it is very clear that even if it were successful, there would be a whole host of unintended consequences from that strike. All of those unintended consequences could be very bad indeed. So there's a great premium on the United States and on the other countries in the world to band together and have really successful diplomacy against Iran to prevent that from happening.
So I think when I've been out talking about my book in various places, people seem to be very curious to know whether you've talked about the degree of difficulty associated with a military attack on the Iranian nuclear program, but speaking as someone who planned these kinds of activities when you were defense secretary, if you were faced with the decision 6 months from now, a year from now, it looks as if Iran is moving to weaponize. Clearly they're going to have weapons within a year. Would you recommend to the president either an Israeli or an American or a joint Israeli-American military strike, or would you prefer to try to contain Iran with nuclear weapons after they develop them?
I don't like either of those alternatives, Phil, and I would work instead to put a much more serious effort, much more effective effort on the sanctions, which is a way of avoiding having to take military action. I am convinced that to deal with Iran, it takes coercive action. But I think the coercion does not have to be military. I think it can be done with diplomacy if we work hard enough and effectively at the diplomacy.
Phil, let me mention just a couple of things. I agree with everything Bill said. I think here are two things I'd like to add. One is part of diplomacy has to be to get the Saudis and other countries to turn up the oil spigot if the Europeans, and I think they probably will, cut off the purchase of oil from Iran. Because you see what's already happening to oil prices now. You see what's happening to gasoline prices. It's crucial that we increase the supply to make up for the Iranian deficit if we do put an embargo on Iran. I think putting an embargo on has dangers, but it's certainly less dangerous than an all-out attack. So that's one thing. Diplomacy has to include the oil in a big way. The second thing is I think the Iranian military needs to understand that I'm not part of any kind of planning. I've no classified briefings on this subject, but my guess reading from the outside is that it would not just be the nuclear installations that we would go after if there is an attack. And it certainly needs to be a last resort, but if it happens, you're going to have to take out a lot of nuclear installations, not one or two. You're going to have to take out the electrical grid, which feeds the nuclear plants. You're going to have to take out everything that threatens the Persian Gulf. And the Iranians have already said they may close the Persian Gulf, or will close it if they are even embargo, let alone an attack. So that means the Navy and the Air Force. I think and it means defensive missiles, because you got to fly over. It means offensive missiles that would be used in retaliation. So you're talking about a significant kind of attack here. At least that's my guess, and it is a guess. The Iranian military needs to understand that. The sober part of the Iranian government, to the extent there is that, needs to understand this is where we're heading if they do not make adjustments in what everybody believes is a quest to build a nuclear weapon.
I'd like to come back to Sam's comment about the price of oil and the Gulf. I was Secretary of the Treasury in 1973 when we had the Arab oil embargo. I was acutely aware that President Eisenhower had said, and put in a program to that effect, that if we imported more than 20% of the oil we use, we were asking for trouble in national security terms. So here comes the Arab oil embargo. I said, President Eisenhower had a point. The price of oil goes up, messes up our economy. It happens periodically, usually due to problems in the Persian Gulf area. And I say, how many times do you have to get hit on the head with a 2x4 before you realize somebody's hitting you on the head with a 2x4? So can we do anything? Yes, we can. Aside from getting Saudis to pump more oil, we can do better here. This new fracking technique, it's really important that it get handled well so we don't have some environmental disaster connected with it. But it's opening up natural gas and oil supplies, not only in this country, but elsewhere. So there's a real chance that we can change the geopolitics of this energy equation. And that would be a tremendous achievement. It's also true that now, for the first time with this roller coaster of high oil prices, people get excited, they go down, everything stops. Now there is a very substantial amount of work being done. I know at Stanford there is, I know at MIT and Georgia Tech, other places by university people, good scientists, good engineers, on looking for ways to use energy more effectively, alternative forms of energy, and so on, and people are getting somewhere. So this time, when the price goes up, we get excited, the price goes down. For goodness sakes, let's keep sustained support for energy R&D going so that we develop these resources as best we can. Now, I think one of the lessons from looking at the nuclear situation, as Sam has said, is let's stop letting ourselves get hit on the head with a Middle East 2x4 and develop our resources and take care of ourselves.
So I know as we proceed here, I'll invite questions from all of you here, and as well those of you who are watching electronically. I'll ask a few more questions and then we'll take questions from all of you. Going back to what I said at the beginning, the sense of a receding threat of nuclear weapons. At the height of the Cold War, believe it or not, between the United States and Soviet Union, there were a total of some 70,000 nuclear warheads, enough to practically obliterate planet Earth had they been used. Today we're down to around 22,000 total in the world. Most of those are controlled by the United States, which has 5,000. Russia has more than that, and then there are a handful of weapons in places like China, Pakistan, Britain, France, etc. There's still a lot of weapons. And my question to Secretary Perry is, we have 5,000 weapons. Some of those are on reserve. But even under the new START treaty that we reached with Russia, we're going to have a ceiling of 1,550 deployed warheads, meaning warheads that can be launched within a matter of minutes. Under what circumstances do you think the United States should use nuclear weapons today? And how many do we actually need to have?
I cannot conceive of the circumstances where, as the Secretary of Defense, I would recommend to the President the use of nuclear weapons. We maintain them today to deter other countries from using nuclear weapons against us. How many does it take to provide that deterrence? Certainly not 5,000. Probably a few hundred. The reason we don't go down to a few hundred now is because we're concerned that Russia has so many nuclear weapons, and that there might be either a military or at least a political problem from doing that. So we try to get down jointly with Russia. The last treaty, the New START treaty, had the United States and Russia both moving down on nuclear weapons. But we have to break that. I mean, we have to break that impasse. We need to get down dramatically lower than the levels we have today. And in terms of any reasonable or rational view of what our security needs are, at most they're measured in a few hundred, not a few thousand.
So, Senator Nunn, I noticed a week or so ago there was a leak, news leak. It was clearly done deliberately and maliciously, suggesting that President Obama and his administration, which is looking at reductions in nuclear weapons, might consider dropping the number down to 300. And that immediately set off an uproar in Congress, particularly among Republicans, who said that would be catastrophic, a reckless sort of abandonment of American defense. You spent many, many years on the Hill. Given your goal of trying to drastically reduce the number of weapons and ultimately eliminate them, how in the world do you get that kind of idea accepted in the current political atmosphere in Washington?
Well, we have to get the election over before there's a rational atmosphere, but I would be shocked if there's any kind of planning going on in the Department of Defense to cut our weapons to 300 unless the Russians cut theirs down to no more than that amount, and unless other countries in the world pledge not to come up. So this next big round cannot be just U.S. and Russia. It has to be all nuclear countries. I don't think we want to be building down even with Russia while other countries come up. So I would be shocked. I would imagine, just as you said, Philip, that report was a leak that left out the fact deliberately that whatever was being contingently planned, whether it's 300, 500, 1,000, 1,200, whatever, would relate to deployed weapons and would be reciprocal. It would not be unilateral. That would be my view on it. So, but I think the administration needs to do a much better job of clarifying things. You can't just ignore leaks like that. They pretty much have ignored it. It seems to me they should have said this has got to be reciprocal, not unilateral, and other countries in the world have to be involved too, and this is strictly hypothetical planning. I think there's a case to be made. Our foundation has had 2 or 3 studies done, a couple over here and a couple in Russia, totally unclassified, about what you could do. And it seems to me the next round should not be obsessed with numbers. It ought to be obsessed to the extent that there's an obsession with trying to make weapons less relevant. That means getting them off a quick launch. Why are we, 20-some years after the Cold War ended, still in a position where the President of the United States and the President of Russia only have a very precious few minutes to make a decision whether to blow up God's earth if a general comes in and says, we think we're under attack. We think we're under attack. The Russians are probably even more vulnerable than we are to some type of preliminary preemptive type strike, because most of their submarines are in port and they're not exercising their missiles as much as they used to do. So survivability of weapons as you move down is all important. It's not just how many you have, it's how many you would have if another country launched a first strike. We need to take away the first strike on both sides. That means a lot of military-to-military type discussions. And it means getting weapons, in my view, on the next round in different categories. We don't need 1,500 or 2,000 weapons ready to launch in 10 seconds or 20 seconds or 30 seconds. Neither do the Russians, but we need to move together on this to have weapons that are in reserve and a lot less weapons on what I call hair trigger. In my view, it's fundamentally in the interest of national security interest of the American people for the president of Russia not to have only a few minutes to decide whether his generals are correct when they tell him they think he's under attack. We've had one or two instances, without getting specific, in Russian history and one or two in U.S. history where you would want a president to have a chance to have a cup of coffee and sober up while he was making that kind of decision about whether to end the world. So it seems to me that numbers are not simply the measure. It's a question of making weapons less relevant and getting other countries like Britain and France and China to join in this next round of deliberations.
Secretary Schultz?
There's only one word for this situation that Sam described. We in Russia on hair trigger alert to destroy the world. That word is insanity. Why can't we get over this absolute insanity?
So
on the political side, let me just make a point. In the last presidential campaign, we were fortunate that both Senator Obama and Senator McCain, the two candidates, endorsed what we were doing. And since the election, President Obama has taken up this idea aggressively, and Senator McCain has, in a powerful speech on the Senate floor, continued his support. So we've tried to keep this whole thing in a nonpartisan stance. It's one reason why this leak, and I agree with you, Sam, I don't know why the administration hasn't made a clarifying statement right away to get that subject off the table. Another thing to remind people of is, we all remember the pictures of Hiroshima when the bomb hit the war. As I understand it, a thermonuclear weapon that we now have in our arsenal is many orders of magnitude more powerful than that. So if one were dropped in the Bay Area, it would incinerate the whole Bay Area, gone. It's a tremendously powerful weapon. And it is why, as we've talked to various religious groups, the evangelicals, or you read the Catholic literature, the Bill Swing, the retired former Bishop of California who has a international thing going, you talk to these people and they all say, where does it come that an individual human being could press a button and kill millions of people? There's something immorally wrong with that. So there is a growing sense from the religious communities, not just one, communities plural, that there's something morally wrong with this nuclear weapon business.
I think it might be interesting, let me just ask Secretary Perry to describe the phone call he got one night. This was back when you were Undersecretary of Defense in the Carter administration. Mm-hmm. If you think these notions of making decisions on short notice with limited information are unrealistic, listen to this little anecdote.
This happened in the height of the Cold War. At the time, I was the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, and I got a phone call about 3 o'clock in the morning. I sleepily picked up the phone. On the other end of the phone was the general who was the watch officer that night at the North American Air Defense Command, telling me that his computers were indicating 200 ICBMs on the way from the Soviet Union to the United States. Now that really gets your attention. It was, of course, a false alarm, and the general had recognized it as a false alarm. And so instead of calling the president and getting a decision, he was calling me to say, what the hell had gone wrong with his computers? So he wanted to have a good answer to that question before he briefed the president on the next morning. Well, that was just one of 3 false alarms that I'm personally familiar with in the United States. I don't know how many happened in the Soviet Union at that time. Had the general not made the right decision, had he actually called the president would have had about 5 minutes to decide whether to launch our nuclear forces. And had he launched them, of course, it would have been a mistake. So the problems, the danger of an accidental wars were very, very real to me. And as a consequence, while at the time I was working to build the U.S. nuclear forces, the MX missile, the Trident missile, the Trident submarines, the B-2 bomber, all of those things we were building at that time. But by the early 90s, the Cold War was over, and now I'm becoming the Secretary of Defense. I said, this is the time to try to get rid of these dangers. And so when I was Secretary, I actually worked to eliminate nuclear weapons. During the 4-year period, we actually eliminated about 8,000 nuclear weapons, dismantled 8,000 nuclear weapons, and I thought we were on the way to dealing with this problem. But since that time, we backed away from the dismantlement. Russia and China are both building new nuclear weapons. The United States is discussing building new nuclear weapons, and we're moving in the wrong direction. We're moving the opposite direction from where we ought to be moving. So the danger is starting to build again. And on top of that, we have the terror threat, which has already been described as a concern beyond the concern of a nuclear war starting.
Senator Nunn, you had a comment?
Kissinger put it this way. He said, "We have stolen fire from God. Let us hope we can contain it before it consumes us."
Just a couple of more examples along the line Bill's talking about. In I believe it was 95, 96, we launched a commercial, we the U.S. launched a commercial satellite, and the Russians had gotten notice of it. You give notice on these things, but it bureaucratically gotten lost. So they saw this launch and thought it was a missile and went on a higher state of alert than they did in almost any instance during the Cold War. So that was in the last 12 years. One other instance in the last 5 years on our side, Bill can explain how this could happen, but it did happen. On my board, we have Gene Haberger, who was former head of the Strategic Air Command, which controls all the nuclear forces. He's retired, of course, and he says this couldn't have happened, but it did happen. He's kidding when he said it didn't, but we had a bomber that loaded 4 nuclear weapons on it. The pilots, nobody knew they were nuclear weapons. It flew all the way across the United States with nuclear payload where we didn't know they were on the plane, we didn't know they were missing, and the base in Louisiana that received the plane didn't know they were on the ground for something like 24, 36 hours, something like that. Now, nothing happened. But that shows you if they had had a problem, a malfunction with the plane, the engine, or anything else, and decided they wanted to lighten the load, guess what they would have dropped? Because they thought these were dummy bombs. They didn't know they were basically nuclear weapons. So those things happen. We need to take those things off the table as much as possible. You're not going to have an absolutely safe world, but you can reduce the risk very significantly. Warren Buffett has a way of expressing this with numbers. He says if there's a 10% chance of a nuclear explosion in a single year, and this 10% chance persists for 50 years, then you have only a 0.5% chance of avoiding that kind of thing over that 50-year period. If you can reduce the 10% chance to 1% chance, then you increase to 67.5% chance that you will not have that kind of incident. So it's about reducing risk to the lowest possible level. That means you have to cooperate with other countries. You have to have dialogue with other countries. In my view, we have to have increasing military-to-military dialogues under civilian-type guidance. And one parameter of that, one concept, would be to increase the warning and decision time for every leader that has nuclear weapons in the world. That would be a mandate that our military, I believe, over a period of time, could begin working with to significantly reduce risk.
So let's welcome some questions here from those of you here in Palo Alto and elsewhere around the country who may be watching this. Do we have microphones to circulate around? Yes. Okay, so this gentleman in front, please.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for the work you're doing, and not only is it important for nuclear weapons, but I think you're setting an example that intelligent and reasonable people from both sides of the political spectrum can work together to solve problems. And I hope that some of your successors and colleagues in Washington are paying attention to that and maybe can learn from it. My question, I think you really pointed out the importance of oil as being, in a way, the root cause of much of the risk in the world today and the need for energy independence. Many people believe that we need more nuclear power plants in the next decades as the only viable way to start to close the oil gap, which seems very reasonable, yet at the same time it seems almost like a contradiction to say nuclear power to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons. And I'm wondering if any of you have given thought to that or have a position on the importance of nuclear power.
I think that my colleagues here have all given a lot of thought to that. Just to set the stage a little more, to amplify on your question, if I may. You all know, of course, that the generation of electricity from nuclear power plants requires the enrichment of uranium to fuel those plants. And historically, until very recently, enrichment levels were raised fairly high to operate some of these reactors. There's now technology to operate them at low levels of enrichment. But once you go down that enrichment road, it's not that hard to go from low to high to bomb grade. So let me start with Senator Nunn, because I know your group, NTI, Nuclear Threat Initiative, has spent a lot of time thinking about this and studying it. How do we, as this gentleman has said, how do we develop nuclear power without risking the proliferation of highly enriched uranium?
Well, there's an organization called the World Association of Nuclear Operators that it came into existence after the accident in Ukraine. And that organization does peer reviews. They're utility-based all over the world, some government-owned utilities, but it's basically the peaceful use. They do peer reviews, and they do best practices, and they do efficiency. Done a terrific job. We've all, there's a counterpart organization domestically in this country on nuclear safety. On the security side, there was a pretty big gap because the International Atomic Energy Agency is primarily making sure that peaceful nuclear commercial energy is not diverted to nuclear resources. But it doesn't get into the question the security of facilities, the stealing of nuclear material, the theft of nuclear material, et cetera, which is a terrorist nightmare. What we've stood up in Vienna now, and there are about 500 members, just been in existence about 2 years, is a security organization that's a counterpart to the safety organization that's been in existence for 20 years. Security would look at things like locks on doors, perimeter fencing, how do you protect the materials, best practices, that kind of thing. So that's underway, and right now, Bill's on our board, and George and I have talked about this, but we now have an agreement that we're working on with WANO so that security and safety begin to have parallel tracks and work together on that. So that's important. I'm in favor of nuclear power. I think it's important, it's clean energy, but you've got to have security and you've got to have safety. Now the thing that is going to interrupt nuclear power in this country, and we've got 2 plants being built in my own state of Georgia now, right now. But the thing that's going to interfere more than anything else is the cheap price of natural gas, because you're going to see a huge amount, I think, of converting coal to natural gas, which is good, but it does, the economics tilt against a whole lot of robust development of nuclear energy in this country. In China and a lot of other places, they're going to have nuclear energy, and our job is to work around the world to help make it safe and to help make it secure. Let me give you one example of what I call sword, the biblical expression, turning swords into plowshares. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, I alluded to this, 3 countries gave up their nuclear weapons, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Bill Perry led the way on that when he was Secretary of Defense. One way we got Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons was to make a deal with them, the United States and Russia, so that they would take their highly enriched uranium out of their bombs, take it to Russia, blend it down into low enriched uranium, could be made into nuclear fuel. The United States purchased a 20-year agreement to buy it. We've been buying that highly enriched uranium, blended down into low enriched uranium. burning it in our power plants for the last 15 years. Have another 3 or 4 years to go on the agreement. If you look at the nuclear power in this country today and look at electricity, nuclear power represents about 20% of the electricity. 50% of the nuclear fuel burning in our power plants in America today is coming from highly enriched uranium, blended into low enriched uranium, which is now being burned. So 10% of all the electricity in America today is coming from bombs that were aimed at us during the Cold War. It shows you what you can do with cooperation, and it shows you the relationship between the legitimate use of nuclear energy, which can be a blessing for mankind, or the destructive use of nuclear energy, which can be a threat to God's universe.
I respect Sam's respect for all of the international work on safety in nuclear power plants. But then, Sam, there's Fukushima. Yep. The Japanese are very intelligent, orderly people. But what we see in the Fukushima example is a complete breakdown of the regulatory activity. There's examples of all kinds of regulations that were not enforced. Then the plants were designed so that they depended on power from outside the nuclear island. And that power got knocked out by the combination of the earthquake and the tsunami. So that led to the Fukushima catastrophe. Now, I'm sure they're examining all the nuclear power plants in the United States and elsewhere to be sure that there isn't that vulnerability. But it's just an example of the fact that it's easy to overlook something. You can make an assumption, and it turns out the assumption can be wrong and the result can be catastrophic. So I think my bottom line on this is anything you do with nuclear matters, whether it's weapons or power plants or whatever, you've got to make safety an overall overriding goal.
Other questions here?
So, do any of you have any insight into what the Russians are thinking with respect to Iran? I mean, do they actually not believe that nuclear weapons in Iran would not be a threat to them? Or, I mean, it just doesn't seem that's a reasonable assumption, given that the geopolitics of that region is awfully tense, as well as with Iran and the United States.
Secretary Perry, do you want to jump in?
The Russians that I've talked to are concerned about the nuclear programs in Iran. And the Russian government has some mixed feelings. For one thing, they were selling a very costly reactor, the Bushehr reactor, to Iran. And so they have economic ties with Iran, which were important to them. But they have supported, they supported our view in two different respects. First of all, they have assured that the Bushehr reactor sent the fuel back to Russia for processing. So there was not the danger of the fuel from the Bushehr reactor going into nuclear bombs. And secondly, they have some modest support for the sanctions we propose. They need to get fully on board there, and they're still reluctant, I think because of their economic sanctions. I mean, because of their economic interest in Iran. But I've seen Russia in the last couple of years go from being indifferent to what was going on to Iran to being quite a bit concerned. They're not quite as far as I would like them to be yet, but they're moving in the right direction.
The Iranian threat, however, is not the only one connected with Iran getting a nuclear weapon. It's widely believed that if Iran should get a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would buy one quickly, which they could undoubtedly do from Pakistan. You'd have a proliferation. You'll start going in the wrong direction. And the more weapons are spread around in the more different places, the more unstable the situation is. So I think it's really very serious.
I think the Russians agree that it's a threat, but I think that governmental position is impeded from what we believe is logical by their economic interest also. I think their economic interests are very strong with Iran. And also the fact that Russia has a very large Muslim population, and they take note of the fact that during the Chechen problems they had, military, terrible strife there, a lot of people killed. They believe the Iranians were restrained and did not stir it up, that they could have made it a lot more difficult and could make it a lot more difficult for them in a lot of their Muslim areas. So all of those things enter into it. But I think what Bill and George said is correct. I think in the longer run, there are a lot of Russians who really are worried. I mean, after all, the Iranian weapons would be right on their borders. And I think what George said about proliferation is exactly right. I think there are at least 5 countries in that area of the world that if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, will have their own nuclear program very quickly.
Isn't there also maybe an element here? We'll be the good guys, let the United States be the bad guy. That somehow or other, if the United States is really worried about it, somehow or other we'll deal with it and we'll take the brunt of it. I think there's a little of that.
Yeah, and then the Russians have misfortune from their point of view that most of their economic trade on military and nuclear type matters are with people that we label, and most of the world labels, bad guys. So they basically say, you want to put sanctions on all the bad guys, those are our customers. So it happens to be a lot of truth to that.
I think there's a question over here.
I've been to Iran fairly recently, and my impression there is that whatever support the Iranian government gets at this point comes to a significant extent from the fact that they're seen as standing up to the U.S. somehow. So it seems to me that the more we threaten the government essentially, and they stand up to it, the stronger the government becomes, which doesn't give me much hope for the sanctions. Has there been any thought to getting out of this dilemma somehow?
Well, I'll just make a brief comment, and then I think Secretary Schultz might address that. I was in Iran, that was probably 10 years ago now. It was during a period of some liberalization. Khatami was the elected president at the time. The clerical leadership was still, calling the shots ultimately. But what I found is that even though I think the number is some 75% of Iranian citizens are under the age of 30, and that's one of the reasons there was so much unrest in Iran a few years ago. They are eager to overthrow the clerical theocracy there. But when it came to the question of nuclear weapons, when I talked to people, they took pride in the fact that Iran was developing nuclear power. They said that Iran had every right to become a nuclear nuclear weapons state. So I think there is something to what you're saying in the sense that the more we go after them in a funny way, the more the population of Iran may rally around its leadership as much as it may detest that leadership. Secretary Schultz, do you have some thoughts?
I don't buy into that.
Okay.
I think if you get yourself in the position that you're never willing to take on a problem because the people you're taking on won't like it, you'll never do anything. You got to face up to the realities. And there have been lots of polls of Iranians showing a rather pro-U.S. attitude, for that matter. I think the Iranian scene, as best I can read it, is in chaos right now. Inflation is high, unemployment is high. It's actually a divided population. I think maybe half are Persians, lots of other ethnic groups in Iran. So there is a seething situation there. I thought we made a mistake in not, when some years ago there was a uprising over the stolen election, that we didn't push harder and show we were certainly on the side of those who were protesting. So I think if you say to yourself, we can't do anything if the people we're doing it to don't like it, you just disarm yourself.
I agree with that. I think if we do not squeeze economically, the alternative is going to be an attack, and it will not be necessarily U.S., but certainly Israel feels that they have an existential threat if the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. And I think if they do not feel there is progress being made in terms of the economic sanctions that have a hope of bringing about a result of the Iranians not developing a nuclear weapon, I think we'll have a war. So you've got to look at alternatives here. And there are not many bright spots relating to the Iranians right now, but the one spot that's not quite as dark as others is that they continue to say, including the Ayatollah, that it would be a sin to develop a weapon, that they have only a peaceful program. Now, do we believe them? No. Should we believe them? No. But that is a face-saving fallback for them if they do give up what they say they don't have, which is a nuclear weapon program. They say that what they're doing is simply nuclear energy. Now, the problem is they've gone from 3 or 4 or 5% enrichment, which is what you need for legitimate nuclear fuel, to about 20%. And that's getting very close, Bill, to weapon usable type material. Then to have an effective weapon, you've got to go higher than that. And they haven't so far done that. But there's every reason that they can. And that's the horrible dilemma of this whole nuclear equation. The same technology that allows you to enrich up to 4 or 5% for legitimate commercial purposes, and it's done all over the globe, is the same technology by which you go to way above 20% and you have a nuclear weapon. So that's the dilemma. But there has been discussion, to give you a little bit of hope, about the Iranians. In fact, the Ahmadinejad at one point endorsed this, that they would take all their enriched material above a certain level, swap it out for finished products which could only be used commercially. And if they did that, that would buy everybody some time. It wouldn't stop the program. It wouldn't stop their knowledge of enrichment. That's going to be very hard to unwind.
Let me address that question specifically. I do believe that a military attack against Iran would have the consequence of pulling the people together behind a regime they do not like. So that would have that negative consequence. The sanctions, on the other hand, while they hurt the people, they also cause the people to be more restive and more unsettled. And I do believe that the government in Iran, which is concerned about its ability to stay in power, fears that these sanctions will cause such a degree of unrest that it might lead to their overthrow. We're trying to influence the government with the sanctions. And I do think we are influencing them because they are concerned about this restive nature leading to an overthrow of their government. So I continue to favor not only the sanctions that we're conducting, but making them much more severe than we have so far.
If there were to be a diplomatic engagement with them, I would put forward this kind of a package. I could say, you said that your program is for peaceful purposes, that is power plants. The amount of enrichment that you are putting into place far exceeds anything conceivably that you could use for your own purposes. Therefore, it must be so that you intend to sell it on the international market. So we'll help you get into the international market and be part of a regime that I hope Sam Nunn will get put into place one of these days. You've made some progress in that regard. And of course, part of being part of the international market is that there is strict international supervision with all the enrichment plants. So everybody knows exactly what's going on. We know that the enrichment is not being taken up to other levels and so on. And call the card.
In the long run, that's where the world has to go. Everybody that enriches in the world is going to have to be under 24/7 camera, in my view, including U.S. We're exempt from that now, and the nuclear weapon states are exempt from this kind of supervision. We can voluntarily do it, but we're exempt. So, one thing, starting with the UN Security Council, we basically have made, not only made nuclear weapons relevant, we've basically made nuclear weapons a symbol of power around the globe. And that's one of the psychological problems in trying to stop proliferation around the globe. It's a matter of prestige with a lot of countries to have a nuclear program. The expression I use is it's very hard to basically get somebody not to start smoking when you're chain smoking yourself. And so that's the condition of all the nuclear powers now. So putting everybody that enriches under international control and having enrichment centers so you don't have very many different groups enriching is the long one way to go on this. We have created a fuel bank. Warren Buffett put up $50 million. The world matched it by $100 million. This has been going on for 5 years, and our organization played a big role in it. There now is a fuel bank that is funded. They haven't bought the material yet. There's going to be a backup fuel supply so that any country that doesn't exercise its, quote, sovereign right to enrich will be able to be eligible to use this fuel supply for a legitimate commercial nuclear purposes if they are cut off from the marketplace by some way. So to me, that's the first step toward a long-range movement toward international supervision and control. Supervision would be too strong. International monitoring of what's going on, so we know exactly what's going on with enrichment. Please.
How do you see the interplay between countries that have a strong national spending ability due to oil reserves, like Iran certainly, but Venezuela also, and potential cooperation for proliferation for nuclear weapons in these countries, in particular those that are politically unfriendly to the United States?
Secretary Schultz.
I couldn't get the question.
Can you repeat the question more loudly, please?
How do you see the interplay between countries that have strong national spending ability due to oil reserves, like Venezuela or Iran, and potential cooperation for proliferation of nuclear weapons in those countries, in particular those that are politically unfriendly to the United States?
Well, the Russians have plenty of oil. The Venezuelans, as you pointed out, have plenty of oil. The Iranians have plenty of oil. I think that our problem is not so much to say, how about them cooperating to enhance the importance of oil? Didn't seem to work that way. Our better approach is to enhance our ability to produce oil and others around the world so that we cut them down to size, so to speak.
You know, we have had such a change in the oil and gas equation in the last 3 years. I was on the board of an oil company, Chevron here. 5 years ago, we were talking about how do you basically build terminals to import LNG, liquefied natural gas. In the last 5 years, we're talking about terminals to export gas rather. So the gas picture has dramatically changed the energy equation. I had the head of a major oil company tell me the other day for the first time that we have, if you took Mexico and Canada and added them to the United States, we have a chance to really have no net imports of gas or oil if you put gas and oil together in the next 10, 15 years. Now that depends on technology, it depends on safe fracking on the gas, it depends on Canada developing its resources, depends on pipelines and so forth, but the energy equation has changed dramatically. And I also think we're going to get some changes. George heads up an MIT effort that has got all sorts of exciting technology, and Stanford's got a huge amount going on, Georgia Tech. I think we're going to get some breakthroughs technologically, but oil and gas will remain important for a long time to come. But it's changed dramatically. There was even an article, I don't take it seriously yet, but at this stage, but it was an article recently by an economist that said, posed the question, should the United States join OPEC? So we've had some big changes. For the better.
Question?
Another one online, two of them actually. How do we remove nuclear materials, even a single one, from getting into terrorist hands? And related, where do nuclear materials end up? How are they disposed once removed from the weapons pool?
Secretary Perry or Senator Nunn?
I trust Senator Nunn on that first question, I think.
Well, we've had a program going on since 1991 that Senator Lugar and I sponsored called the Nunn-Lugar program, and we have a pool of funds that came originally from the Department of Defense and went in Department of Energy and Department of State, but primarily Defense and Energy, where we have helped countries, particularly former Soviet Union countries, get control of their nuclear materials as well as their nuclear weapons, as well as their chemical and biological materials. When the Soviet Empire broke up, it was unprecedented. They had some thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons, tons and tons of chemical weapons, and an awful lot of biological program development. So we've been helping not just Russia, but those other countries get control of those materials for a long time. And now Senator Lugar, with his strong leadership, has expanded the eligibility of that program to include other countries around the globe. And it's been used in areas where there are chemical residual weapons that we've helped get rid of, and so forth. Now, if the North Koreans, if we ever get an agreement, for instance, with the North Koreans, the economic part of it would be very important. And that kind of program to help them with their nuclear materials, getting them under control, getting rid of their weapons, would be very important. We've helped the former Soviet states destroy some approximately 8,000 nuclear warheads in the last 20 years. These are, at one point, it was an extreme danger. There would be leakage of information and so forth. We have one plant, a chemical plant, that I've toured 2 or 3 times with Senator Lugar called Susha, and that's a place in Russia where they have 1,999,000 artillery tubes full of nerve gas. God only knows why anybody wanted to develop that much during the Cold War, but we figured, Ash Carter was with us once, he figured, Bill, there was enough nerve gas in that one site to kill everybody on the face of the earth 4 times over if it was properly disseminated. And of course you wouldn't, that's the problem with nerve gas, It's not properly disseminated. So this huge arsenal, we're better off than we were by far in the early 1990s. A lot of progress has been made, but there's a long way to go. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's still 32 countries with weapon-usable nuclear material. So a lot of work has to be done. Bill played a huge role in that when he was Secretary of Defense.
So what do we do with nuclear waste? I mean, it's an issue not only with warheads, but with nuclear power. And the United States has had political discussion about this. Yucca Mountain was going to be the site, and then Senator Reid said, not in my backyard. So what is the solution to dealing with nuclear materials that you're going to be developing in nuclear power plants that, you know, out of the running of nuclear reactor, you can derive plutonium?
It is now being stored on site in radiation-proof caskets, and I think it's a satisfactory way of doing it for 50, 100 years or so. Over the long term, we need a different solution of the problem, and I think the long-term solution of the problem involves treating the material to remove the dangerous radiation. And there are technical ways of doing that now. They're too expensive and they're not really available. But between now and 100 years from now, when the temporary storage system begins to be not too satisfactory, then I think we will have those technical solutions will be available. So over the short term, put them in lead caskets, store them locally. Over the long term, find a way of treating the material to remove the dangerous radiation.
So I think we'll do 1 or 2 more questions if there are. Wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about China, India.
Sorry.
Yes, okay. China, India, Pakistan. We have this concept of let's say, a superpower where you assert regional influence or global influence through your power. And it seems that certain countries might aspire to be a superpower. How do we get to a situation where some countries are superpowers and other countries don't aspire to be superpowers? Or how do we kind of work out this relationship between these very large and important countries?
Sounds like a question for the former Secretary of State.
Well, I've always been puzzled by why China is so relaxed about having a rather unstable country, North Korea, with nuclear weapons on one end of the country, and another rather unstable country, Pakistan, on the other end of their country. So I would think somehow they would be addressing these issues more aggressively than they seem to. But certainly, as Bill has pointed out earlier, the situation involving India and Pakistan is very tense. And in part because, particularly in Pakistan, they don't have good control. And there's so many people there who have a stake in enmity with India. It's their life. So somebody could easily sneak off and provoke another Mumbai. And then I don't think you could expect the Indian government to have the restraint that they had the last time. And you could easily see something explode. And if it does result in a nuclear exchange of any consequence, that can put a cloud that could affect the whole planet, for that matter, if it goes far enough. So whenever I get a chance to talk to the Chinese quietly, I say, come on, why don't you get more constructive? And they say, well, we don't have any control, but I think probably they do.
Maybe one more question in the back here.
So you talked about we need to slow down the decision loop in terms of if there's been a first strike. And could you comment on the British's solution to this? They have the last letter where the Prime Minister decides ahead of time, and then it's up to the individual sub-captains. Is this more effective or less effective than our 5-minute decision time? Is this more sane or less sane?
That might be a question for Bill Perry.
I think any plan to use nuclear weapons, whether it's in 5 minutes or 50 minutes, is not sane by definition. The British system has one merit over the United States system in that it takes more time and more people, and therefore it's less likely to lead to an impulsive reaction.
I would add that someone who lived in the Soviet Union for a while as a reporter, my journalistic colleague David Hoffman did a wonderful book on looking back at the Cold War planning and dealing with nuclear weapons in both the United States and Soviet Union. And what he discovered was that they had something that was known in shorthand as the dead hand system, which was imagined that there would be a moment in a nuclear exchange where the leadership in the Kremlin would be decapitated, and that even the senior military commanders would no longer be in a position to instruct and order a strike, and it would all be done automatically at some point, which, when you think about it, fortunately we're not in that position anymore, but that was truly a nightmarish scenario that they had developed to take it out of the hands of the actual decision makers.
He wrote a book called The Dead Hand.
Yeah,
and I advise you not to read it. It's too scary.
Unlike my book, right?
But yeah, that's right. But this book is very readable here. It's a great book that Philip has done, and I recommend it very strongly to you.
Thank you. So
I wanted to thank everyone for attending and thank our distinguished visitors for sharing their thoughts on a truly, truly fascinating topic, an important topic facing the world. I thank all the people who were listening in. There were about 450 registered people listening to this talk on our virtual site. So thank you all for coming, and a warm welcome and thanks to our visitors.